Three, two, one. What's up, guys? It's Dakota, and today I'm going to bring you a sweet new deck that we got in the modern format with the unbanning of Stoneforge Mystic. I believe probably about over a week at this point. Yeah, over a week at this point. And one of the sweet decks that kind of came out like the first few days after the unbanning, and kind of what we saw at the SCG event last weekend. Bant mid-range being a deck that can play some utility flash threats like Restoration Angel, Vendilion Click, and Spell Queller, and even the new card from Modern Horizons in Ice Fang Codal gives you some kind of sweet targets to slap your equipment on and kind of play this value-y mid-range deck in the format and play these invasive creatures that can just slowly take over the game. So I'm just going to go over kind of section by section the creatures, planeswalkers, all that stuff, and just kind of go from there. So to start, they are playing 6 different mana dorks in Birds of Paradise and Noble Hierarch. Noble Hierarch, I'm assuming being the go-to one, which I think is weird for a Stoneforge Mystic deck, because I figured you want birds for the evasion more so than the Exalted on Noble Hierarch, but I'm sure you can't go wrong with either split. So Birds of Paradise, obviously adding a mana of any color. Noble Hierarch, adding green, white, or blue, but having the ever so important Exalted text on it just helps you get in for a point of damage when you attack with just a single creature. Ice Fang Codal is pretty sweet. Since it's a blue and a green for a 1/1 flash flyer that draws a card and then has the added bonus of Death Touch if you control three other snow permanents. For some reason, I always thought it was just 3, but learn something new every time I read these cards. So, essentially sticking with the theme of like flash creatures in this mid-range deck, Ice Fang essentially cycles, draws a card when it enters the battlefield. It's flash, so you can play it at the end of your opponent's turn. It's a flyer, which means it has evasion, and then eventually has Death Touch for the slew of other snow-covered lands that you're playing in your mana base, which obviously, well, isn't a whole lot. It's something that may come up from time to time, but I'm sure it's probably like a very minute point to this card because it does about 3 other things that you want it to do. Kazali Pride Mage is, I'm going to assume tech for the mirror matches, or at least the Stoneforge mirrors, where this thing can just tag a sword or it can tag a Batterskull, or maybe a problem like enchantment or artifact that your opponent's playing. I'd imagine it's also good against the 4-color Wurza decks as well. Like you can knock out one of their bridges or one of their potential combo pieces so that they can stop them from going infinite. The build around for this deck, obviously being Stoneforge Mystic and the equipment package that she can get, sort of Feast and Famine and Batterskull, and I'll go over those 2 here in a second. But Stoneforge Mystic obviously being the important card to build around with these slew of like flash creatures and everything. When it enters battlefield, you search up an equipment, put it to your hand, shuffle your library, and then you can pay 2 and tap Stoneforge Mystic to put the equipment into play. Important to note that it doesn't attach to it. You still have to pay the equip cost, but still, when you're getting paying 2 mana to put a 5 mana equipment into play, Stoneforge Mystic is pretty good. And obviously, with Batterskull's case, it also makes a germ attached to it, so it's still pretty good. You essentially get 2 mana for a 4/4 Vigilance Lifelink creature when it comes to Batterskull. But anyway, Stoneforge Mystic making essentially a huge discount on the equipments that you can tutor up. So the main threats, I'm sure that this deck is looking to play. Spell Queller is essentially a creature that can counter something, and while whenever it leaves the battlefield, your opponent gets to cast the card without paying its mana cost. Normally with Spell Queller, you can just get a spell, and then I'm sure you untap and then put like a Sword of Feast and Famine or like even a Batterskull on it, and it ends up being very hard to kill for most decks anyway. I'm sure for like Jund and things like that, like it's always just gonna have hard removal for it, but anyone that's really playing like damage based removal is gonna have a hard time dealing with Spell Queller. Also having an interesting synergy with Teferi Time Raveler. If they manage to kill your Spell Queller, you permanently exile their spell as long as there's a Teferi Time Raveler Raveler in play because of how Teferi Time Raveler is worded and only letting your opponents cast sorceries, and since they cannot cast sorceries with something on the stack, the spell just ends up going away. So Spell Queller has additional value in that sense as well. Vendilion Click, being just a disruptive 3/1 flash flying creature, can take a card that you don't necessarily want in your hand, put it to the bottom. Maybe you even have a Stoneforge Mystic in your hand that you're looking to cast. Click on end step and get rid of like an equipment or something like that that's in your hand, tutor up later, because that's just a boss move that you can do. Click also just being able to like target your opponent and take a card out of their hand, which is normally what ends up happening with Vendilion Click. Is you look at your opponent's hand, and then like if they have a card that you're worried about, you just take it away, and if they don't have a card that you're particularly worried about, then you just leave their hand be, and then you just have this 3/1 flash flyer that you can slap equipment onto. Restoration Angel, having some good synergies with some of the other like creatures that you're playing. Bouncing a Click or even a Spell Queller. Again, with like Teferi Time Raveler in play, if you just like blink a Spell Queller while your opponent has a spell in the stack, like you just get rid of the spell that's underneath the Spell Queller, it's gone forever, and then you Queller their other spell, and essentially that one will potentially be gone forever as long as Time Raveler stays in play. Blinking an Ice Fang Codal to draw a card still also pretty good. Even just a Vendilion Click to either to block or some way like gives you an additional value, and if at worst it's a 4-mana 3/4 flash flyer, still pretty good. Just the added bonus of blinking Queller, Click, or Fang is pretty good. So moving on to the Planeswalkers and the other spells that are in the deck. To Teferi Time Raveler, I'm guessing what this card like has just always done since it's been printed. Makes counter magic looks really bad. Makes your opponents play at sorcery speed, so like they're spending mana on their turn to either deal with Time Raveler or any of your other threats or your swords or whatever. Also giving some utility to any sorcery speed cards that you would be playing, but from the quick look of it, it looks like you're just really wanting to play on your opponent's turn. Jace and Teferi both just like really good one-ofs. Like Jace obviously like being a win condition of its own, Teferi being a win condition of its own, but Jace is able to put equipments and things back into your deck, able to just filter through, and with the number of fetch lands and even Stoneforge Mystics being able to shuffle, always being able to find cards like Path to Exile, Force of Negation, and Cryptic Command to just kind of like keep yourself ahead at that point. And Teferi, kind of like a catch-all removal spell, and also just a source of card advantage and letting you leave up mana to cast like any of your instant speed spells and really just kind of dig for things that you're looking for. And the equipment of choice, which obviously can change depending on what your meta looks like or what tournament you're going into. I've always thought Sword of Feast and Famine in the dark was probably one of the best cards you could play, just because people love playing Jund and things like that. And I think Fatal Push, Assassin's Trophy, Maelstrom Pulse, cards like that are going to be more of a problem than cards like Path to Exile and Lightning Bolt, especially for this deck. So like Feast and Famine just being one of those things that like can put pressure on your opponent, make most removal very hard for them to deal with, especially since all your creatures that you're going to be slapping this onto are pretty evasive. Hitting your opponent is not going to be a problem. Being able to just untap your lands and keep up things like Cryptic Command, Force of Negation, any of your other flash threats, and then also like putting pressure on your opponent's hand and causing them to discard cards. Like, yeah, sure, they might have like dead cards in their hand, but still the fact that you could get to a point where like if they can't play a card, you essentially just lock them out of the game, either by constantly leaving up counters or just knocking those cards out of their hand, is going to be pretty good from time to time. And then of course Batterskull, the reason why we couldn't have Stoneforge Mystic for the longest time, a 5-mana equipment that you can put into play for 2 mana off of the Stoneforge Mystic that ends up being a 4/4 with Vigilance and Lifelink that you can pay 3 to return to your hand and pay 5 to equip. In conjunction with like Sword of Feast and Famine, I can see Batterskull being like really powerful, as you just like tap out to put this on like Restoration Angel or Vendilion Click, and then hitting them with like your sorted and batter skulled thing, you could end up untapping all your lands, essentially like leaving up your counter magic, all your other stuff, and things like that to either blank removal or play like a planeswalker on your turn. Uh, while probably not the most ideal situation, like most of the time, just Batter Skull being equipped to a germ is going to be pretty good in that sense. The mana base, things like that, mostly from the looks of it, like just a few fetch lands here and there. There's like a bunch of like twos and ones and twos of lands. Playing 4 Flooded Strand, I think that gives the deck about eight fetch lands. I'm sure like just the Prismatic Vista, you play 5 basics. You want to be able to get blue a lot of the time and green. So I'm sure that with Flooded Strand and Windswept Heath, you're able to get any green duels to play your dorks on 1, but then you also have mostly Flooded Strand, so you can get your basic islands and basic plains for obviously the other spells that you're playing as well. The sideboard, Ceremonious Rejection, there's a lot of Eldrazi Tron and just regular Tron in general showing up. So having counters for like Chalice on 1 and Chalice on 2 is probably pretty good, because this deck, while maybe not necessarily getting blown out by those cards, but it could force you to play a lot slower, and you won't be able to play your Stoneforge Mystics to tutor up your one of equipment. So having Ceremonious Rejection as like the counter spell for those decks is pretty good in my book. Surgical Extraction, and I think the mistake that people were making before is that they were playing like no graveyard hate at all, and I think that was like a huge mistake, because we still had a tier 1 deck in the format that could essentially abuse the graveyard with its infinite combo. So the fact that just kind of like hedging and putting like a few surgical extractions in your sideboard is kind of free, because there is some matchups where like you can conceivably bring them in to basically be a card that's actually playable instead of just completely dead. Also, there's Dredge kind of running around, things like that. This is kind of like a safe like 2 maybe 3 cards that you put in your sideboard dedicated to graveyard hate. Definitely not playing the 4 Leyline of the Void or 3 surgical extraction, things like that. There's no need for that anymore, but definitely having some sort of hate in your sideboard is pretty good with me. Veil of Summer, the really just like kind of Jund decks, like mid-range decks, and even like blue-white and things like that. Veil of Summer, if like at worst it negates like a Thoughtseize and then draws you a card, and then you can just kind of like play your Stoneforge Mystic, things like that. Usually pretty good enough. Essentially just digs you a card deeper, looking for possibly like your Path to Exiles or counter spells in the worst case. Damning Sphere, another card that you can bring in against like Eldrazi Tron and big mana decks and things like that, with Amulet Titan also kind of being on an upswing too. Like this kind of shuts off their soul lands, and also makes it harder for them to play like Summoner's Pact into Titan when they have exactly 6 mana in play. Dovin's Veto, just an uncounterable negate all the time. Obviously not when your opponent has a Teferi Time Raveler, but just very good in like the control mirrors. Maybe stops like a damnation or wrath effect type thing, and then lets you kind of beat in for the last points of damage. So just fine as a 1-of in the sideboard. Core Firewalker and Night of Autumn, definitely cards that you bring in for the burn matchup. Probably Core Firewalker more like for that, and the mono red decks, like the prowess decks, things like that. This card's very good. Obviously, gaining you life, and then also being a creature that they just can't really attack around with really anything that they have. So just overall a fine card to play in the sideboard. Night of Autumn, a card that's really versatile that you can bring in against Wurza. It's a card that you would definitely conceivably want. Against burn, gains you life, can destroy an Eidolon, even if it's just a 3-mana 4/3 in some cases in those same matchups that you're playing against like Wurza and stuff like that. This card's fine. Winds of Abandon, exiles a creature, and then they search for a basic land. It's basically a super Path to Exile that can be Wrath, or they can be a Wrath, and then also a card that you can play at instant speed from a Teferi Time Raveler. How often is that going to come up? Probably not. Also, the fact that most decks aren't playing as many basics as you are, Winds of Abandon really doesn't cost you anything, and it gets around a when you overload it. It does it? Yeah, when you overload it, it gets around cards that have like hexproof and things like that. So just a fine card. Probably something else that you could play in place of this if you didn't want to play this card, but nonetheless, I'm sure there's times where it might come up where you need to overload it and just wipe your opponent's entire board and they get one basic land out of it. Also, something, and I just kind of now realize it, and the more I keep talking about it, if your opponent goes infinite with Thopters, I'm sure you're probably not winning that game anyway, but like you can just Winds of Abandon all their tokens, and they only search out like one basic land. Again, probably still not winning that game, but you can say you got them. Finally, the last one, and a kind of sweet card that I liked seeing, Sword of Steel, Sinew and Steel. Kind of the reason why I liked Feast and Famine is because Feast and Famine gave you like pro black, and definitely here getting pro black and pro red. While Restoration Angel is pretty clear of like burn spells and things like that, and with Vendilion Click getting out of range when you throw like Feast and Famine on it for a lightning bolt, definitely having protection from black and from red is probably the second best protection sword that you can have. And also the fact that this is a card that you can bring in for the mirror, even though if you're playing like blue-white control or like Bant Stoneblade or some kind of Stoneblade variant, this can destroy a planeswalker and destroy the equipment that they go and get. And it's just a lot of value when you just get in one hit with this sword, even if the protection necessarily isn't relevant. And why this deck can leverage it better than probably most other Stoneblade decks is because of all the just evasive threats like Restoration Angel, Vendilion Click, and Spell Queller, and Ice Fang Hodl. If you just slap this thing onto one of them and it hits once and you just destroy like their Jace or their small Teferi or big Teferi or what have you, and then you also tag their equipment as well, it's going to be a pretty big swing in your favor. And again, just that one hit gets off. You know, if you kill like a sword and a Jace, like for potentially 4 mana investment, you got 7 mana off the table, and they're only ever going to really be able to activate a planeswalker once, unless it's to like bounce your flash threat, in which case you flash in another one, slap the sword onto it, hit them, and then rinse and repeat until they just cry to their mothers. And that's the whole 75 for Bant midrange, at least the deck that Goldfish gave me. I think this deck is sweet. I thought there had to have been some kind of like flash deck that you could play with Stoneforge Mystic to essentially just kind of abuse the fact that your opponent wouldn't really be able to interact with you, and more so not be able to interact with cards like Teferi Time Raveler, making it hard to effectively deal with your threats when they have to deal with them on their turn, and then you're also playing things on their turn. So all in all, I think this is a pretty sweet Stoneforge Mystic deck. I would go out on a limb and saying probably one of the, I'd say top 3 Stoneforge Mystic decks you could play, but that's of course up for debate, and I'm always willing to hear people out in the comments of the video. And that's really it for this deck tech. If you guys enjoyed this and want to see more, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you think is the best build for Stoneforge Mystic. If it's just a traditional Stoneblade deck, if it's like the fitting it into a blue-white control shell or Jeskai shell, what have you. Let me know in the comments, and be on the lookout for new videos in the future, and I'll see you guys later.